Today, I would like to briefly deal with the subject of historical literacy, which has to do with becoming literate in the subject of history. More specifically, I would like to briefly address the history of learning among the people of North America prior to the 20th and 21st century. However, before briefly engaging in this, I'd like to remind viewers that in the 20th and the 21st century, we take for granted the instant access that we have to information. From our first few years on this planet, particularly in the industrialized world, we are surrounded by sources of information that allow us to see and read news about what has happened around the world in a matter of a few minutes or less. Our means of learning is no longer limited to sitting in classrooms or reading dusty old books by candlelight at a desk. We can get educational information from our TVs, our computers, our cell phones, and even our wristwatches if we have the most up to date watches. Just 50 years ago, many sources of learning were not available. And if we go back 100 or more years, we would notice that the means of learning was even more restricted. The primary method of learning back then in the early United States was not done by computers, but by books. And although the printing press had been invented, textbooks were used primarily to educate people, and these textbooks were composed by someone manually writing the words on a page, which became bound to other pages and which eventually were bound together to form a book. The books used to teach students the basics were known as primers, or some might say primers. Such books were used to initially teach students religious lessons and were known as primer prayer books. The religious connotation associated with primers was carried over from Europe to the American colonies where books taught students the alphabet, the pronunciation of vowel sounds, words, and religious lessons that revolved around scriptures or religious lessons associated with morality. And when efforts were put forth to teach Native Americans how to read, the same approach was employed. While researching information for this presentation, I came across lessons in one of the primer books which indicated the word servant, and I wondered whether or not anyone who had come across this term, who was a slave at that time, thought that this was justified, or whether he or she should actually be learning from such a book. The same question came to my mind when I came across a primer that contained other vocabulary words which could have stirred up the enslaved person's mind and may have led that person to rebellion. Well, with computers in schools so prevalent in the world today, it is difficult to imagine how anyone that was attempting to learn how to read without a tutor or without some modern device that could have helped them to sound out the words or the vowels actually became competent. or competent reader. Well, that concludes our brief presentation today. Hopefully, something that was said was helpful in your quest for learning history and historical literacy. Thank you.